It's the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Pires coming to you from Baltimore. China's legislature began its annual meeting on Sunday. In one of its first moves, it approved a lower economic growth rate of 6.5%. This is the lowest growth rate that China has planned for in the last 20 years. The country is currently facing a number of economic problems, including excessive pollution, industrial overcapacity, and a very large private and public sector debt load. However, other than the lower growth target, analysts do not expect China to change its economic course for now. The consequences of not changing course could lead the country into more serious problems, according to some analysts. Joining us now to take a closer look at the Chinese economy is Richard Vague. Richard is a managing partner at Gabriel Investments and a chair of the Governors Woods Foundation, and he's the author of The Next Economic Disaster, Why It's Coming and How to Avoid It. Thank you so much for joining us here, Richard.
Thanks for having me.
So, Richard, why is the economic growth target slowing down in China?
You know, we suspect that their actual growth rate's quite a bit lower than the 6.5% that they mentioned, and it needs to be. They have massive overcapacity and are continuing to create more and more overcapacity. So we suspect the step down from 7% to 6.7% and now to 6.5% is just them trying to let their forecast catch up with their reality.
Now, isn't China an economy that has tremendous more capacity to grow in relative to other more developed countries like the U.S.?
You know, they have grown very, very rapidly. A lot of that growth in the early 2000s was export dependent. And that, of course, came to an end in 2008. And since then, their high growth rate has been debt dependent, private debt dependent. They're financing growth that's really not needed. They're building housing that's not needed. They're producing steel and coal that are not needed in large part. So, you know, no, we don't think that there's the capacity for them to go back to a 10 or 15% growth rate. We think their published growth rates are higher than their growth rate is, and frankly, higher than their growth rate needs to be.
Now, Richard, last time we talked about the Chinese economy, my assumption was that the world economy was slowing down, and therefore the demand for Chinese goods aren't as high. And of course, that meant that the Chinese authorities were turning the economic demand to a domestic demand. And you said that's not the case. The domestic demand isn't as growing as fast as the Chinese had expected. Is that still the case?
You know, the consumer sector of the economy is the smaller part, and it is growing rapidly. But the concerning thing about that is that that growth is debt financed. Consumer or household debt is now growing twice as fast as business debt. So we see kind of a yellow to red flashing light there as well as they go for this rebalancing.
Now, part of the reason for the debt is, of course, wages. I mean, wages aren't going up, at least not very dramatically. And from what I understand, there is a lot of labor unrest in the country. Give us some sense of where the workers are at in terms of demanding higher wages. And not having higher wages is obviously contributing to this debt burden you're speaking about.
Well, China's big competitive advantage for at least a couple of 3 decades has been its low wages. But we've seen its wages now get to a level where they're above, for example, wages in Mexico. So that competitive advantage has largely dissipated, and that makes it, frankly, much harder to increase wages from here. You couple that with the fact that there's significant earnings pressure in those industries like steel and cement and coal, where there is overcapacity, and in real estate, where there's 50 million empty homes and ghost cities in the United States, or not in the United States, in China, that you see that there's not a good formula for continuing to have high wage growth. And I'm sure that has come as unpleasant news for a lot of workers.
Right. And as you are saying, and I also mentioned in the introduction that China is currently facing a number of issues like pollution, overcapacity in terms of production, not so much demand for their goods as in previous years from abroad in terms of exports. Now, is this are these the major issues, and is there other ways in which the legislature could redirect the economy? In other words, where are the capacity there in terms of growth, and should they not be redirecting it?
I think an imperative for China's economy is to lower actual growth, to stop compounding the problem. They could be growing at 3 or 4%, publishing that number. That's a very respectable number. And frankly, they have demographics working in some ways in their favor. Since population growth is flat, that creates less of a platform for dissent and for pressure as might exist in a country where population was growing fast. So we think stopping creating additional overcapacity is at the center of the way they need to be addressing the problem.
Right. And in your opinion, where are the areas in which the economy, be it 4% or otherwise, but where are the potential of the economy in terms of developing more positive growth? In other words, is there pollution is a problem? Is there a way of doing a green economy in China, excelling on the production of solar panels and other such examples?
Well, we think going up the value chain in manufacturing is where any country needs to head, and China's in a superb position to do that. We know in engineering, in construction, they're at the leading edge of what the world can do. We've seen them, I'm involved in medical research. I know that China has made a great effort in some very leading edge genetic research. There's numerous areas like that. Robotics is another, where they could be moving up the value chain. To me, that's where their emphasis should continue to be, to a larger extent than merely taking the, kind of the mass-produced commodities and continuing to pound out overcapacity there.
And turning towards the United States, what do you make of the current Trump administration's policy towards China and in terms of trade and this kind of joint stimulation in terms of the economies?
Well, I think the United States has had a better hand to play on trade than it has played, frankly, for decades. We have been conciliatory on trade matters in order to get political support or military support or the like. We've been kind of frittering away our advantages at the edges. I think we hold far more cards than China does if we play them correctly. China needs us more than we need China, frankly, to put it bluntly. I don't like the way the Trump administration goes about handling this, but I do think there's room to be more assertive in how we do business with a lot of countries, not the least of which is China. Frankly, China's in a fairly fragile position. I think there's actually kind of a remote danger that we could contribute to trouble there in a way that we might not intend.
All right, Richard, I thank you so much for joining us. And as these legislative meetings unfold in China, we'd like to come back to you in the near future. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
And thank you for joining us here on the Real News Network.